Hello, I'm Keir Cutler. Some years ago, I made a video titled Shakespeare Authorship Question, Why Was I Never Told This? It has been viewed over 40,000 times and remains highly relevant today. In that video, I called attention to a document called the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt about the Identity of William Shakespeare. The declaration had received international attention when it was launched by Shakespearean actors Sir Derek Jacobi and Sir Mark Rylance, founding artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. A lot has happened since I made that earlier video, so we thought it'd be a good time to revisit the declaration and tell you some of what we've learned, especially about our opponents at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. The Declaration of Reasonable Doubt has been a great success. Thousands have signed it online at the website of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, or SAC. It's an impressive group. Over 1,500 with advanced degrees, nearly 700 current or former college or university faculty members, and 84 notables. Shakespearean actors like Jacobi and Rylance, Michael York and Jeremy Irons, leading theater directors, outstanding academics, and former U.S. Supreme Court Justices John Paul Stevens and Sandra Day O'Connor. Signers represent virtually every field, but interestingly, English literature is the field with by far the most signatories. Now, why is this important? Stratfordians, defenders of the traditional attribution of the works to the man from Stratford, have long argued that the phenomenon of doubt about the authorship is due to intellectual or character defects of doubters. Rather than deal with evidence that doesn't support their position, they distract attention from it by attacking all doubters as either incompetents or snobs who cannot accept that a man from humble origins could have become a great writer. This is nonsense. Now, those who make these claims when challenged, they never back them up with evidence, and leading experts in psychiatry, psychology, and the social sciences, many of whom are doubters themselves, dispute these claims. Now that we have the declaration and can see who signs it, anyone can see who doubters really are, as opposed to the false stereotype promoted by Stratfordians. But the focus of the declaration is on evidence, on both sides of the controversy. Stratfordians have found it difficult to deal with the evidence in the declaration. Neither the Birthplace Trust in Stratford, the leading defender of the traditional theory of authorship, nor any supporter has attempted a point-by-point rebuttal. Now, the Birthplace Trust did, however, launch an authorship campaign in 2011, starting with what it called 60 Minutes with Shakespeare, a website featuring audios of 60 people giving 1-minute answers to questions posed by the Trust. The questions were self-serving, and the answers misleading, so knowledgeable doubters quickly wrote rebuttals to all 60 of their answers and posted them in a document titled Exposing an Industry in Denial, available at the SAC website. As Mahatma Gandhi supposedly said, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. The Trust's authorship campaign shows they knew they could no longer ignore us, and their campaign of ridicule was no longer effective. They had no choice but to fight, so the battle was joined. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that doubters have won on the merits. Why do I say that? Because in waging its fight, the Trust found it necessary to resort to tactics of misrepresenting, falsifying, and concealing evidence, which would have been unnecessary if the facts supported their case. Let's look at some examples of the Trust claims in 3 key areas. 1, the Stratford man's will. 2, whether the Stratford man's name was the same as the author's name. And 3, the documentary record of allusions to the author Shakespeare by his contemporaries. A typical example of the tactics employed by the Birthplace Trust is the answer of historian Michael Wood, a life trustee of the Trust, to one of their 60 questions. Now, Wood started out by claiming that, quote, to deny Shakespeare's authorship is to deny the primary sources, above all, his will, unquote. He never elaborated on what it is about the will that makes it so important to the case for the Stratford man. And later events show that the Trust itself does not believe Wood's claim. A leading doubter rebutted Wood's statement as follows. As primary sources go, the Stratford man's will is the one document that's most damaging to claims he was the author of the Shakespeare canon. It contains no reference to any Shakespeare play or poem, nor to writing, nor writers of any kind. Nor does it contain any reference to books, bookshelves, papers, manuscripts, letters, or any intellectual property, things any professional writer would mention in his will. Okay, so the meaning and significance of the will are in dispute. But how do we know the Birthplace Trust does not really believe Wood's claim about the will? The answer is in a book sponsored by the Birthplace Trust 2 years later, in 2013, as another installment in its authorship campaign. The book is titled Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Evidence, Argument, Controversy, edited by Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells, both top officials for the Trust. This book was written to prove that the actor from Stratford was beyond doubt the playwright William Shakespeare. As the first book ever by Trust officials to address the authorship question, it was meant to be a definitive statement on the topic, with contributions by 22 prominent Stratfordian scholars. Yet, nowhere does it ever mention the will. Its omission is revealing. It shows that the Birthplace Trust knows the will doesn't support its case, contrary to what Wood said in 60 Minutes. Is there any other way to interpret it? In response to the Birthplace Trust book, the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition published a competing book titled Shakespeare Beyond Doubt? Exposing an Industry in Denial. It includes an entire chapter on the will, explaining in detail why it isn't the will of the playwright. Plus, the full text of the will is in an appendix. The will is strong evidence against the Stratford man, as the Trust surely knows. That's why the Coalition book features it, and the Trust book totally ignores it. Fortunately, not everyone is taken in by their book. An article in a major British newspaper reports that Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh and husband of Queen Elizabeth, when asked by Professor Stanley Wells of the Trust if he was a heretic, replied, "All the more so after reading your book." Astute fellow, Prince Philip. Another example of the Trust's tactics involves false claims about what the record shows as a spelling of the Stratford man's name in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. An important issue in the authorship debate is whether the Stratford man's name was actually the same as that of the author. Not once did Shakespeare of Stratford spell his name the way it appeared on the title pages of the published works. Now, the spelling on the works is very consistent. Shakespeare or Shake-speare over 95% of the time, and always with a middle E after the K, as in the two words shake and spear. Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford never used that spelling, nor does it appear in any of the 26 entries in the Stratford Parish Register for him and 4 generations of his family members. So there's a clear, consistent, statistically significant difference between the two sets of spellings. The lack of a middle E in Shakespeare's name means that the first syllable would be, at least today, pronounced shack, not shake. This is now standard among doubters, although we cannot be sure how Shakespeare pronounced his own name. To doubters, the two different spellings indicate 2 different pronunciations and 2 different names. Stratfordians disagree, claiming they are variant spellings of the same name. In their writings, they routinely changed all instances of the name Shakespeare in the record to Shakespeare, airbrushing the name Shakespeare out of existence. This allows them to say things like, "Of course Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare," when in fact the issue is whether Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford wrote Shakespeare. Now, it's one thing to claim that the different spellings are variants of the same name, but quite another to falsely claim that the spelling in the record is Shakespeare when it's not. But that's what the Birthplace Trust does in its book in 2 places. In his own chapter, Chapter 7, Stanley Wells says that the Stratford man's name is spelled Shakespeare in his burial record in Stratford. It's clearly Shakespeare. How did a leading expert like Stanley Wells get the spelling wrong? And why did neither he nor Cambridge University Press correct it after we pointed it out? And in Chapter 11, David Cathman claims that a grandson born to the Stratford man's daughter Judith was named Shakespeare after his grandfather, who had recently died. Like Wells, Cathman put the name in quotes, implying the spelling he shows is identical to what appears in the record. It is not. Here is a reproduction. There are 8 letters. The name Shakespeare has 11. No matter how one reads these letters, they do not spell Shakespeare. And when the child died in 1617, the entry for the burial spells the name as Shakespeare. So regardless of which record he was looking at, Cathman misspelled the name. It's difficult to believe that Cathman misspelled Shakespeare's name by accident, since he has an article on the spelling issue on his website and is supposedly an expert. Now, why is this important? By the time Shakespeare died, the great author Shakespeare was famous. If Judith wished to honor her father by naming her first son after him, why spell the name differently from the name of the playwright? It makes no sense unless Shakespeare of Stratford was not the author Shakespeare. So Cathman and the book's editors, Edmondson and Wells, had a strong motive to falsify the spellings. These are the only two places in the book, in Wells' chapter and Cathman's, that refer to the Stratford parish records of the family's name. And they got both wrong. Our next examples are also from Professor Stanley Wells' chapter in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. Chapter 7, on allusions to Shakespeare to 1642. Wells said up front that his aim was to cite all references to Shakespeare from 1593 to 1642. In fact, he omitted two clear references, both of which cast doubt on the authorship. First, in 1624, Thomas Vickers published a manual of rhetoric in which he gave a list of excellent English poets, but he omitted the name William Shakespeare. Well, surely he knew about Shakespeare in 1624, after the first folio was published. In a later edition, Vickers corrected the omission, saying that, quote, "To these I believe should be added that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear," unquote. Here is a clear reference to Shakespeare that suggests the name is a pen name. Vickers probably knew the first folio attribution was incorrect, and he didn't want to go along with it, so he omitted the name from the earlier edition. By the time of the later edition, he had figured out a way to include Shakespeare in the list while hinting the name was a pen name, but without the risk of saying so, whatever the risks may have been at that time where there was no freedom of expression as we know it today. Now, whether or not this interpretation is correct, Vickers' comment is a clear allusion to Shakespeare. Why did Wells omit it? To bury Vickers' indication that the name Shakespeare was a made-up pseudonym. It certainly seems so. Second, in 1635, Cuthbert Burbage, brother of famous actor Richard Burbage, petitioned Philip Herbert, Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery, in a legal case involving the Globe Theatre. The Burbages were founder investors in the Globe Theatre, and Shakespeare had been a player and shareholder. Cuthbert Burbage certainly knew the role that Shakespeare had played in the company. In his petition, he named the investors in the Globe. He named Shakespeare and Shake-speare, both without a middle E, as one of several deserving men and several men players. From these terms, it doesn't sound like Burbage thought of this Shakespeare as the great playwright William Shakespeare, just an investor and member of the acting company. Burbage didn't call him Shakespeare and didn't call him a playwright. By 1635, the name Shakespeare was well known and would have always been spelt that way in print when referring to the playwright. Further, the man who Cuthbert Burbage was petitioning, Philip Herbert, was a dedicatee of the first two folio editions of Shakespeare's plays. If Burbage knew the deserving man and man player was also their playwright, he would have, one, spelled the name correctly, and two, identified him as their dramatist. That he did neither shows he knew his fellow actor and shareholder was not the dramatist William Shakespeare. Burbage's petition is extremely powerful evidence against the Stratfordian theory. A contemporary insider, who surely knew the truth, in a legal petition to a powerful earl, also in a position to know the truth, named Shakespeare not as a playwright, but as a player-investor, and he was legally bound to tell the truth in such a document. Here again, Stanley Wells had a strong motive to omit this allusion, and so he did, even after first saying his intent was to include all allusions to Shakespeare. Not just once, but twice did he omit key allusions that contradicted his orthodoxy. So there you have it. Multiple examples of misrepresentation, falsification, and concealment of evidence in the authorship debate by officials of the Birthplace Trust. Each of them was called to the attention of Edmondson and Wells, and they did not deny them. The coalition also lodged a formal complaint with Cambridge University Press. They too didn't dispute any of the specifics, but dismissed them as differences of quote-unquote opinion, when they are clearly verifiable facts. They never replied to a follow-up letter pointing out that these are errors of fact. Finally, I should mention that in his own chapter in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, the Reverend Dr. Paul Edmondson, head of research and knowledge at the Trust, wrote that it is not acceptable for non-experts to question the positions of expert authorities such as himself and Stanley Wells. It is difficult to conceive of a more authoritarian, anti-democratic, dogmatic position, one that is totally antithetical to long-standing academic traditions of freedom of inquiry. With all the errors in their book, it is clearly unwarranted. It turns the issue into a quasi-religious orthodoxy to be accepted on blind faith, rather than an open question of historical empirical fact. But, given what the facts show, no wonder Edmondson does not want to be challenged. The Trust knows its position is untenable. This is confirmed by the fact that they refuse to participate in a test of their claim that the authorship is beyond doubt. In our book, the Coalition challenged the Birthplace Trust to participate in a mock trial of the question before an unbiased panel of judges. They summarily declined. The Coalition reissued the challenge in an ad in the Times Literary Supplement, offering to donate £40,000 to the Trust if they proved their claim beyond doubt. Again, they declined. Does anyone really believe that the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust would decline an opportunity to expose us as the ignorant fools they claim us to be, put the issue behind them, and bank £40,000 for doing it if they thought they could? Skeptics now have a valid claim to have won on the merits. The Trust conceded. At least doubters have the courage of their convictions, while the Trust does not. Showing that the Trust lacks sufficient confidence in their position to engage with doubters is another major achievement of the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. It was their felt need to respond with their authorship campaign that exposed them. It seems that the Trust and its top spokesmen, Stanley Wells and Paul Edmondson, also have doubts about whether Shakespeare was the author William Shakespeare. It is their job, however, to protect the tradition and Stratford's tourism industry, like attorneys defending a client. Their role is to advocate, not seek the truth. What can we conclude from all of this? Well, the implications are clear and profound. One does not misrepresent evidence as they did unless one knows what it means. And one does not claim the authorship is beyond doubt, then refuse to defend the claim even for £40,000 for proving it beyond doubt, unless one knows one cannot. Shakespeare the player and Shakespeare the playwright were not the same person. The two different spellings represent two different names of two different people. One, the actor, investor, businessman from Stratford, and the other, the made-up pen name of the poet-playwright William Shakespeare, whoever that may have been. What we know now, beyond reasonable doubt, is that it was not the Stratford man. This is confirmed by a massive evidence, including that presented in our own book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, and the original Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, and the follow-up to it, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, both on the SAC website. But especially by Stanley Wells' omission of two key allusions to Shakespeare. Both allusions speak for themselves, but ironically, Wells' attempted concealment serves to call greater attention to them and confirm their meaning and significance. It is clear that the Trust, as a leading tourist destination, has a conflict of interest. And doubters have long thought that this is what accounts for their intransigence. But their reaction to the Declaration leads us to ask if something else underlies it. The Trust seems so desperate to suppress the debate that it's hard to understand. Refusing £40,000 for proving the basis of their existence as a charity seems odd. Misrepresenting key evidence is worse. Are they perhaps hiding something else? When the Trust declined a trial, SAC Honorary President Alexander Waugh wrote an ebook, Shakespeare in Court, featuring a hilarious hypothetical mock trial to show how such a proceeding might have gone and why the Trust chickened out. But if Waugh's trial is funny and revealing, another part of the book is damning. Using records in the Trust's own archives, WA showed that 5 of its tourist sites, Shakespeare's Birthplace, Anne Hathaway's Cottage, Mary Arden's Farm, Hall's Croft, and Tom Nash's house, are not what the Trust claims them to be. Now, it's long been known that no record shows that the Stratford man was born in the so-called birthplace, but WA goes further and shows it's absurd to think he was born there. WA also shows that a cellar under the birthplace is the only portion which remains as it was when Shakespeare was born. So there's no evidence he was born there, and the parts tourists pay to see don't even date from the period. Looking at the other 4 sites, not only does nothing show that Mr. Shakespeare courted Anne Hathaway at the advertised Anne Hathaway's cottage, nothing shows that Anne ever lived there. What the Trust bills as Mary Arden's farm is not where Mr. Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, lived. The building they call Hall's Croft, which the Trust now advertises as the home of Dr. John Hall and Shakespeare's older daughter, was built much later. Now, the Trust did once own Tom Nash's house, but they tore it down. So what they now call Nash's house is not. So regardless of who Mr. Shakespeare really was or was not, 5 of their leading tourist attractions aren't what they say they are. How can the Trust be unaware of all this? Could it be that they are deliberately duping the public about their tourist sites? Now, why would they do that? For the money from their tourism industry, of course. The town of Stratford-upon-Avon is a theme park, Disneyland for Shakespeare. The mission of the Trust is to conceal this from the public, defend the myth that Shakespeare was the author, and preserve Stratford's tourism industry at all costs. How has the Trust suppressed the Shakespeare authorship question for so long? By aggressively maintaining and exploiting their position as leading authorities. The Trust keeps a short leash on academics and on media coverage of the issue. They ruthlessly attack any academic or reporter who questions their orthodoxy. Using these tactics, they've made it a taboo subject in academia and the media. Media rely on experts, but what if, as it appears here, the experts are corrupt? Most organizations and individuals seeking to advance the authorship question see it as a typical academic controversy to be solved by evidence and argument. But is it realistic to think that with all the evidence that has turned up already, which the Trust has effectively denied and suppressed for 160 years, something new will turn up that they cannot deny and suppress if they are still deferred to as the authorities? Evidence alone is insufficient when one side in the debate always sits in judgment. It's ironic that the Trust and its officials present themselves as guardians of the legacy of William Shakespeare, and tragic that journalists defer to them as such. No one should be a judge in their own cause, yet that is what they get away with. Perhaps only if their credibility is first called into question will anything change. A formal complaint against the Trust for consumer fraud might accomplish that, and in light of their falsifications, it is warranted. But is anyone willing to do it? It can only be done in the UK and only by someone who has in fact been defrauded. Shakespeare valued truth, and even in this post-truth age, it is worth fighting for. The Declaration also challenges their credibility, and the more people who sign it, the more likely others will stand up and be heard. So please sign it if you haven't already. As I said at the start, this video follows up on an earlier one that I made titled Shakespeare Authorship Question, Why Was I Never Told This? Please take a few minutes to watch it, then read and sign the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt at the website of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. You'll be in good company if you do. It's at doubtaboutwill.org. Again, that's doubtaboutwill.org.